video, we will be discussing how to pass the Uniform Bar Exam, or the UBE. If you're following along in our handout that we've created, you'll notice that it's broken up into different parts. The handout starts by discussing what is the Uniform Bar Exam, then it discusses how to pass the MEE, then it discusses how to pass the MPT, and then finally, how to pass the MBE. In this video, we're going to be talking about each part in turn. First, what is the Uniform Bar Exam, or the UBE? The UBE is an examination created by the NCBE, or the National Conference of Bar Examiners. And the UBE consists of three components. The MEE, that stands for the Multi-State Essay Examination. The MPT, which stands for the Multi-State Performance Test. And the MBE, that stands for the Multi-State Bar Examination. It's also known as the multiple choice portion of the exam. So let's talk about each one of those components in a little bit more detail. First, turning to the MEE, or the essay portion of the exam. This portion of the exam makes up 30% of your total bar examination score. And what this portion of the exam consists of is you are going to be given 6 essay questions, and you have 30 minutes to complete each question. According to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, the following areas of law can be tested on the MEE. It can test civil procedure, constitutional law, contracts and sales, criminal law and criminal procedure, evidence, real property, torts, an agency, partnership, corporations and LLCs, family law, conflicts of law, decedents' estates or wills, and trusts and future interests. Turning to the MPT portion of the bar exam, or the multi-state performance test, this part of the bar exam will make up 20% of your total score. And this is the only area of the bar exam where it is not testing your ability to memorize the law. Instead, you're going to be handed a test booklet with 2 tasks enclosed. And these tasks are considered closed universe, meaning you should not use your knowledge of the law not found in your test booklet. Instead, they simply want you to read what's provided in the booklet and complete the tasks as they are assigned. So really, practice makes perfect here, which we'll discuss when we get to how to pass the MPT. More specifically, the MPT, if you're taking this with our regular or straight time, meaning no accommodations, you will be handed a test booklet with 2 tasks, and you should spend about 90 minutes on the completion of each of these tasks. Finally, the MBE, or the multiple choice portion of the bar exam, makes up 50% of your total bar examination score. Here, this part of the bar exam consists of 200 multiple choice questions, 175 of which are scored. On exam day, you will be faced with 100 questions in the morning, and you'll have 3 hours to complete this portion. Then everyone will take a break, and you'll come back in the afternoon to complete 100 more questions in 3 hours. There are 7 areas of law that are tested on this portion of the exam, and they are all tested equally. These 7 areas, according to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, that can be tested are civil procedure, constitutional law, contracts and sales, criminal law and criminal procedure, evidence, real property, and torts. So again, you'll get 25 questions on each of those areas of law. That means that you will encounter 25 experimental questions that will not be scored. However, most people cannot tell the difference between a scored question and an experimental question, so it's obviously best that you answer as many questions as you can, if not all of them. So now that we have a little bit more information about what is the Uniform Bar Examination, let's next talk about how to pass the MEE, or the essay portion of the exam. So our first tip that we have for you is to study smart. Do not treat all areas of law or all subjects equally. You can tell from the frequency chart in our packet, found on page 3, that not all subjects are tested equally. In fact, if you take a look at that frequency chart, civil procedure is the most highly tested area of law. It has shown up the most compared to all of the other subjects here. Additionally, take a look at criminal law. You can see that criminal law has shown up the least amount of times on the MEE exam. So getting back to our general tip here, it's important to keep this in mind and to keep this packet as a good resource as you move forward in your bar exam preparation. It's not that you should ignore any areas of law when preparing, but knowing how frequently things are tested can help shape how you prepare for this examination. And by that we mean you should spend more time on those highly tested areas of law. Why? Because it's more likely than not that you'll see those more frequently tested areas show up on your bar examination. Our next tip is just like all of the subject areas are not tested equally, as I just mentioned and referenced the frequency chart. It's also good to know that all topics within each subject are also not tested equally. So I'm not going to go through all of these in this video today, but if you are looking for a more in-depth guide about what is tested and how these different topics are tested within each subject on the MEE, you should be sure to check out our How to Pass the MEE video, where we talk about those things in much greater depth than we are going to be in this video here today. But a few things I do want to point out that you can find in your packet if you are following along with me. In reference to civil procedure, not everything within Civ Pro is tested equally. For instance, you'll notice that subject matter jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction are very highly tested. Those are two topics that you would want to be very familiar with before you take the bar exam, because they show up quite frequently whenever civil procedure is tested. Similarly, when it comes to contracts, contract formation is very heavily tested. So you want to be sure that you've tried your hand at practicing some of those questions. And when it comes to topics, or I should say subjects like real property, you can see that things like deeds, recording act, and leases are very popular topics to show up here on this examination. And even for subjects that are not that highly tested, like conflicts of law, for instance, you can see in this packet that when they do test an area of law, like conflicts of law, you can see how it gets tested. So again, knowing how to expect some of these areas of law to come up in your bar examination can help shape how you spend your time in preparation for the exam. That way you can better focus your time on those areas that are more likely to come up than others. Our next tip for you is in how to pass the MEE is knowing how to approach an MEE question. And I think it's really important to understand the differences between the MEE portion of the bar exam and your law school exams that you have been taking for the past few years. But first things first, how do you approach an MEE question? We think it's very important that you follow the IRAC format when it comes to responding to these questions. The goal of responding to an MEE question is to communicate very quickly to the grader that you've addressed all of the issues being tested, and you've done so by addressing the rule, you've analyzed it, and you've reached a conclusion for each of those issues. So by following that IRAC format, you do that very quickly. You communicate that information to the grader quickly, which is going to amount to a higher score, which of course is the goal here. Everyone wants to pass the bar examination. And it's also good to keep in mind, like I stated, how the bar exam, specifically the MEE, is different from your law school examinations. And some of the big differences is that when it comes to the bar exam, usually the questions and issues are very pointed. It's very clear what they're asking you to talk about. Where back in your law school exams, you had to issue spot, and sometimes it wasn't necessarily clear what you had to discuss. The other big difference to keep in mind is that your conclusions matter a lot on the bar exam, at least for most questions. In other words, the way they write these questions and the fact patterns, they're writing them in such a way that in applying the law, you should reach a certain conclusion. There is a right and a wrong answer. That's unlike law school exams, at least the average law school exam, where most of the time professors are testing your ability to reach a conclusion, but the conclusion you reach is a little bit less important. So again, practicing, seeing how they test these issues, and really practicing your application of the law can help make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position possible to reach the correct conclusions on the MEE portion of the exam. Again, for more for more in-depth information on how to pass the MEE portion of the bar examination, be sure to check out our video also on YouTube here that we've linked up on how to pass the MEE. The next thing that I want to discuss is how to pass the MPT, or the performance part of your bar examination. Again, I think this should be everyone's favorite part of the bar examination. I really like it. And the reason I say this, and I try to tell this to anyone who will listen, is because you are in complete control here. You do not have to worry about memorizing the law and pray that you can remember it on bar exam day. Instead, here for the MPT, they do not want you to use your outside knowledge of the law. Instead, they're testing your ability to complete these lawyerly tasks, and they want you to only use the facts and the law provided to you in your test booklet. So, how do you pass the MPT? What can you do to put yourself in the best position possible to do this? Our first tip is to be aware of the most highly tested tasks. And by this we mean you should be sure you practice these highly tested tasks so that if you see one of them, first of all, it will not be a surprise since they're highly tested, and you'll be well equipped to respond to it. The most highly tested tasks on the MPT is the objective memo and the persuasive brief. Our second tip for you as to how to pass the MPT is to memorize the formats. This is super important. There are different types of tasks that they can ask you to complete. And by memorizing the format of each, whether it's an opinion letter or a memo or a brief, if you have these formats down and memorized, and you then utilize that memorization on the bar examination, when it comes to the grader and their scoring of your tasks, knowing that format and putting the information in the correct format is going to very quickly communicate to the grader that you know what you're doing. You do get points for formatting these things properly, so it's best that you memorize those formats. And our next tip, and it's a super important tip for how to pass the MPT, is to practice. It always makes me very nervous when we meet people here at JD Advising and when they're preparing for the bar exam and they put off practicing the MPT. Many people tell me that it's no big deal, it's an easy part of the bar exam, and they'll just get to it later. But instead, practicing the MPT is something that you can start incorporating early on in your bar prep process. And this is really important because here, with this MPT portion of the exam, they're not testing your outside knowledge of the law. Instead, a huge part of your points will be based upon your ability to complete the task in the allotted time. And that is the biggest challenge that examinees have because they put off practicing and then they find that they can't complete these tasks in the allotted time. And of course, that's impacting their score. And for some people, they don't pass this portion of the exam. So how do you avoid this? Practice and start practicing early. If you find that you struggle with timing issues, the only thing you can do is to continue to practice so that you can get a better feel for the clock and work through those timing issues. Next, moving on to how to pass the MBE, or the multiple choice portion of the bar exam. Our first tip for you here is that you should try to memorize the law before you start answering questions. I know a lot of people sit through a bar exam lecture and then they hit the books and they start practicing. And while that seems like a good idea, it's missing a very important step. You have to have the law memorized before you can actually start practicing your application skills. So instead, I want you to view the bar exam process as really having 3 steps. The first step is trying to understand the law or comprehension. The second step is memorization, which we're talking about here. And the third step is application. Be sure that you're not skipping over step 2. So how do you memorize? Just to give you a few tips. A lot of people find it helpful that when they're memorizing, they should chunk their outline, whichever outline they're dealing with. So let's say they're faced with torts and they need to memorize torts. Don't try to memorize the whole torts outline. Instead, start with negligence and break it down into that manageable piece. But you could further break it down. Instead of just trying to tackle negligence, you could break it up into smaller pieces or chunks, such as its elements, duty, breach, both types of causation, and harm. And when you break it down into these more manageable pieces, you can then focus on memorizing each piece at a time. So once you've done that, how can you then memorize it? Many people find it helpful that when they're, say, looking at duty, they read over that portion of their outline and then they cover up pieces of it and they try to write down everything that they remember. And they do this over and over and over again until they can write down the whole rule or everything that they're trying to memorize. And then they would move on to breach and then causation and then harm and do the same thing over and over and over again. Some people are more auditory and they learn by hearing. So they'll repeat the elements to themselves or the rules to themselves over and over again, or they'll record themselves saying it and they'll listen to it. Other people like to make up quizzes or to be quizzed. Some people make up charts or some sort of visual aid that helps in their memorization. Whichever method you're using to memorize, the key to memorization is repetition. So be sure that you're not only putting in the time to memorize, but that you're revisiting previous areas of law and subjects that you've studied before to make sure that you are keeping those memorization skills up to date. Our next tip for you on how to pass the MBE portion is to focus on the highly tested topics. So at the beginning of this video, I told you that the 7 subjects on the MBE are tested equally. There are 25 scored questions on each. However, the topics within each of those subjects are not tested equally. For instance, turning to torts, and again, we know there are 25 scored questions from torts, but how do they test torts otherwise? Well, according to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, we know that negligence makes up 12 to 13 of your 25 scored questions. So this means that negligence alone is 6 to 7% of your total bar examination. Same thing with constitutional law. Again, there are 25 scored questions, but 12 to 13 of those 25 questions comes from individual rights. Again, that's a huge chunk of your bar exam. So instead of trying to memorize every little thing and treating everything equally, instead, you can shift and shape your schedule so that you're focusing on those more highly tested areas of law first. Again, it's not that we're telling you to ignore anything, but it's just helping give your schedule some more guidance about where your focus should be. And then our next tip is that you should try to obtain released questions and practice those released questions. Many people tell us that when they practice with real released MBE questions and then they take the bar exam, they felt pretty well prepared. They felt like when they read the questions in the test booklet, they seemed similar to the questions that they had been practicing throughout bar prep. And that is what we are striving for here. Real questions will be the best way to prepare yourself for the MBE portion. So where can you get these questions from? Well, here at JD Advising, we have licensed questions from the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and we have both online versions and hard copies. You can also obtain these questions from the National Conference of Bar Examiners themselves, and there are other companies out there that make them available. These resources are listed in your handout. And then our final tip here to pass the MBE is to make sure that when you're practicing questions, you're practicing smart. Many people tell me they try to get a certain amount of questions done a day, or they're striving to get, so many questions done throughout all of bar prep. And here at JD Advising, we take a very different approach. We take a quality over quantity approach. And by that, we mean you should dissect questions. What is the whole point of practicing if you're not paying attention to what you are doing well and where you need improvement? So when you sit down to practice questions, instead of trying to get 20 questions done, go question by question and dissect them. Get in the habit of asking yourself, what subject is the question testing? Then from there, ask yourself, what is the legal issue being tested? Try to recite that rule in your head and then try to apply it to the fact pattern to reach a conclusion on your own before you turn to those answer choices provided. And if you get in the habit of doing this, you can start to see where your weaknesses are. Are there areas of the law law that you don't know or that you struggle. Maybe you don't have the law memorized, or maybe you do, but you're struggling with the application portion. So by dissecting these questions, it will help shed light on where you need to improve. And you can do less questions if you're doing them correctly, because it's going to help you get more questions right in the long run. So we hope that you found this video helpful, and if you need more information, please be sure to check out our other videos or contact us about our other services.